North Atlantic, March 1943. The sea is black and endless. Waves crash like cannon fire against steel hulls. Somewhere in that frozen void, 40 merchant ships crawl westward in formation, a fragile lifeline between Britain and America. Their decks glisten under a pale crescent moon. No lamps, no voices, not even the whisper of a radio. Only the rhythm of engines muffled beneath the roar of wind. Every man aboard knows the danger. Beneath them, in the cold silence below, lurk the predators of the Atlantic. Dönitz U-boats. Dozens of them. Waiting. Listening. But tonight, something is different. The convoy's commander, a calm-eyed captain hardened by years at sea, has ordered what no manual prescribed: total silence. No transmissions, no pings, not a single sonar pulse to betray their presence. Only the rhythm of engines muffled beneath the roar of wind. The escorts move in disciplined shadows, guided by instinct and the faint glow of phosphorescence on the waves. And while the Wolfpacks listened for sound and radio chatter to home in on their prey, they find only emptiness. For one night, the Atlantic falls quiet, and in that silence lay a decision, a single act of restraint that would save 10,000 lives and change the war beneath the waves. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its cruel crescendo. For more than 3 years, the ocean had been both artery and graveyard, the vital lifeline feeding Britain's survival and the hunting ground of Germany's U-boats. From the first days of the war, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz understood the Atlantic was the key. Britain, an island nation, lived or died by its convoys, the endless flow of food, fuel, munitions, and men coming from the Americas. Cut those arteries, and the island would starve into submission. The Kriegsmarine had begun the campaign with only a few dozen submarines, but by 1941, Dönitz's Wolfpack doctrine had turned the sea into a killing field. Dozens of U-boats, guided by radio intelligence and meticulous coordination, could swarm a single convoy by night, firing torpedoes into the darkness. The results were catastrophic. Merchantmen burned from stem to stern. Survivors clung to rafts in freezing seas, and every ship lost was a piece of Britain's future gone to the depths. By 1942, the Allies were losing over 500,000 tons of shipping every month. Entire convoys vanished between Newfoundland and Ireland. Sailors began calling the Mid-Atlantic the Black Pit, the stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based air cover where U-boats ruled without fear. The Royal Navy fought back with everything it had: escort groups armed with depth charges, destroyers fitted with ASDIC, the primitive sonar of the time, and new radar sets. But for every U-boat sunk, another seemed to rise. The Germans had learned to use their strength at night and their silence as a weapon. Convoy routes zigzagged endlessly to avoid detection, but even small mistakes, a stray radio call, an echo on sonar, a glint of light, could give away their position. The U-boats, using radio intercepts and high-frequency direction finding, could triangulate signals across the vast ocean. And every time the Allies tried to coordinate through radio traffic, the Germans listened. By late 1942, the Admiralty began to realize that information itself, even a single pulse of it, could betray a convoy. Silence, once seen as passivity, might become the ultimate defense. At the heart of this new realization stood men like Captain Frederick John Walker, a relentless, innovative commander whose escort groups became the terror of the U-boats. Walker believed victory in the Atlantic wouldn't come from brute force, but from discipline, coordination, and deception. He experimented with new formations, sonar traps, and counterintuitive tactics, including, at times, the complete suppression of sound. But while Walker hunted submarines, other captains faced an opposite problem: survival. Their task was not to destroy the U-boats, but to shepherd hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo across an ocean teeming with death. In the winter of 1943, with convoys under increasing assault, this commander faced a choice that defied doctrine. His convoy, a mix of oil tankers, troop carriers, and freighters bound for Britain, had already drawn the attention of German reconnaissance aircraft. Encrypted reports indicated a Wolfpack gathering ahead, waiting in the cold void of the mid-Atlantic. He could radio for assistance, he could signal escort reinforcements, but doing so would light up the airwaves, and the hunters below would hear. So against standing procedure, he ordered his entire convoy to vanish. No lights, no transmissions, no pings from ASDIC. Even the radar in moments would go dark. It was a gamble that few would dare attempt, to trust the sea and silence more than technology or firepower. And in the coming nights, that gamble would face the ultimate test.
By early 1943, the Royal Navy had begun to transform from a reactive force into an adaptive predator. Hard lessons learned in the North Atlantic were reshaping doctrine hour by hour. Convoy escort groups, once improvised units of destroyers and corvettes, had become tight-knit teams led by experienced officers. They knew the rhythm of the ocean, the habits of the Wolfpacks, and the strange silence that settled just before an attack. Every voyage was a balance between communication and concealment. The escort commander had to decide, speak and risk being found, or stay silent and risk being blind. The Germans exploited every sound. They tracked radio signals using HFDUF, high-frequency direction finding. They could triangulate the origin of a signal across hundreds of miles, guiding U-boats toward it. Even Allied radar, powerful as it was, could betray its own presence through emissions that trained operators might detect. The Allies responded with ingenuity. They introduced evasive routes, deceptive transmissions, and strict control of wireless traffic. But it was never enough. Somewhere, somehow, the enemy always listened. And so emerged one of the strangest and most counterintuitive tactics of the war, the Silent Convoy. Unlike standard operations, where escorts constantly communicated to maintain formation and coordinate defenses, the Silent Convoy relied on strict pre-planning. Courses, speeds, and turns were fixed in advance. Every escort and merchant ship followed its assigned track with near mechanical precision. No one broke radio silence unless absolutely necessary. In theory, it stripped the convoy of its flexibility. In practice, it cloaked it from the ears of the enemy. Reports from 1942 had shown that many convoy attacks began not from visual sighting, but from radio interception. U-boats prowled along probable routes, but once they caught even a faint signal, they would swarm in numbers. Dönitz's Wolfpacks were masters of coordination. Dozens of U-boats might be directed to a single convoy once contact was confirmed. Silence, then, was not just absence, it was camouflage. And the need for it had never been greater. The winter of 1943 saw some of the heaviest losses of the entire campaign. Convoy HX-229 and SC-122 would lose 22 ships in a single week that March. The sea lanes between Newfoundland and Ireland had become graveyards. It was during these grim months that one convoy, under the command of an unassuming yet brilliant escort captain, would chart a different course. Records suggest it was a westbound convoy, perhaps designated ONS-5, bound from Liverpool to Halifax, though exact details were often obscured in wartime censorship. It consisted of roughly 40 merchant vessels, carrying everything from aviation fuel to frozen meat, escorted by a handful of destroyers, corvettes, and sloops. Weather forecasts were dire. A massive low-pressure system was sweeping in from Greenland, turning the sea into chaos. Visibility would drop to almost nothing. For U-boats, this was ideal. Rough seas hid their approach, while the cold masked periscope wakes. The Admiralty's signals intelligence indicated multiple U-boat groups operating near the convoy's intended route. The logical choice would have been to alter course or call for reinforcement, but the commander, fully aware of the risks, chose a different strategy. He issued a single order to his ships, encoded, brief, and final. Maintain silence, execute Plan S. Engines were throttled down to reduce cavitation noise. Lights were doused. Radar sweeps were limited to brief bursts, only when necessary. Even depth charge patterns were to be held until a confirmed sighting. No blind attacks, no wasted detonations. The sea swallowed them whole. For 48 hours, the convoy vanished from all detection. German radio logs from that week later revealed a strange gap. Wolfpacks reporting to Dönitz complained of disappearing targets, convoys that seemed to dissolve into the fog. The Admiral staff blamed weather interference, yet in reality, it was something far simpler. Silence itself had broken the hunt. For the men aboard those ships, however, the experience was anything but simple. They sailed through the blackest nights, trusting only in the judgment of a man they could not see, following courses plotted days before. They could hear the distant thunder of the ocean, and sometimes the haunting echo of depth charges in faraway battles. They did not know that their silence was saving them. And as the U-boats searched in vain, their torpedoes fired into empty seas, a quiet revolution was taking place, one that would soon rewrite the very rules of the Atlantic War. The stage is now set for the story's core, the many angles that reveal how this silent convoy trick worked: human fear, tactical brilliance, and technological restraint.
1. The human angle. For the men who crossed the Atlantic in 1943, silence was not peace, it was pressure. On board a merchant ship, the air was always thick with noise. The churn of engines, the hammer of waves, the endless metallic hum of survival. But when the order came down, no transmissions, no signals, no sound beyond what the sea allows, the ocean became unbearable. Each crewman suddenly became aware of every movement he made. The clink of a spanner, the slam of a hatch, the murmur of a conversation. All could travel across still air and cold water. All could betray them. Men spoke in whispers or not at all. Cooks worked by candlelight. Helmsmen steered without radio corrections. Even a misplaced hammering in the engine room was treated like a gunshot in a cathedral. The fear was physical. Beneath their feet, the depth charges were ready. Above deck, the gunners stared into fog so thick they could barely see their own bow. And yet, within that tension, there was trust. The captain had promised them that silence would keep them safe, that the absence of sound would be their shield. As the hours turned to days, that faith became their rhythm. In the quiet, the men learned to read the ocean differently, not through orders, but through instinct. The roll of the swell, the vibration of the engines beside them, the faint hum of the escort's propellers somewhere ahead in the dark. Some later described it as a kind of hypnosis. Others called it terror. But none forgot the moment when the sea became so still that they could hear their own heartbeats.
In that shared silence, 10,000 men, sailors, gunners, engineers, waited together, unseen and unheard, between life and annihilation. 2. The tactical angle. In the War of the Atlantic, knowledge was everything, and sound was knowledge. The U-boats hunted through a combination of intelligence, radio interception, and acoustic detection. Their periscopes saw little at night. Their hydrophones listened to the world below. Every convoy, no matter how disciplined, left a sonic fingerprint. The overlapping churn of engines, the rhythmic pulse of propellers, the chatter of wireless operators keeping formation. When those signals stopped, the entire logic of the hunt broke down. A U-boat commander in 1943 might have been trained to calculate bearing and range by listening. The sounds of ship screws could tell him if the convoy was large or small, fast or slow. A brief burst of radio could betray the convoy's direction to headquarters in Lorient or Saint-Nazaire. But when the ocean fell mute, even the best trained ears heard only chaos, the endless white noise of the sea itself. The silent convoy tactic disrupted every layer of that detection system. No radio meant no HFDF fix. Reduced engine revolutions meant fewer cavitation bubbles, masking propeller noise. Limited radar sweeps meant no emissions for U-boats equipped with radar detectors. Even ASDIC, the Allies' sonar, was curtailed, depriving U-boats of the pings that could help them home in. It was paradoxical warfare. To survive, the escorts deliberately blinded themselves. The tactical discipline required was extraordinary. Every ship had to maintain formation using dead reckoning alone, estimating position based on speed and time without real-time coordination. A single misjudgment could cause collisions or break the screen open. Yet somehow, under the chosen captain's watch, the formation held. The U-boats, meanwhile, found themselves chasing ghosts. In Dönitz's war diary for that spring, several entries mention difficulties maintaining contact and convoys lost due to weather and interference. German radio operators detected nothing but static. Their hydrophone operators mistook natural ocean sounds for ship movements. When they fired torpedoes, they struck empty water. For the escorts, this was more than luck. It was control. The silent convoy turned the Atlantic's vastness into a defensive weapon. The very element that had made the ocean so deadly, its scale, now became its shield. By forcing the U-boats to guess, the captain had inverted the balance of fear. Every submarine that surfaced risked detection by aircraft or radar. Every message sent risked giving away its own position. In a war of invisible hunters, the one who vanished first won. That was the brilliance of silence. It was not passive. It was active deception, an invisible maneuver executed across hundreds of miles of sea. And in the logbooks of that convoy, the proof of its power began to emerge. Ships arriving intact, routes unbroken, and enemy sightings that led to nothing. But the story of how silence turned from tactic to doctrine, from one captain's choice into a fleet-wide principle, begins with the men who made it work and the machines that made it possible.
3. The technological angle. In 1943, technology ruled the Atlantic, but it was still a fragile kingdom. The Allies possessed new weapons, centimetric radar, improved ADISC, the ahead-throwing Hedgehog mortar, and the Lee light that could expose submarines at night. Each device represented a leap forward, yet each came with a cost. Every radar pulse, every sonar ping, every burst of radio transmission carved a trail across the electromagnetic spectrum, a trail the enemy could follow. The Germans had responded with equal innovation. Their submarines carried radar detectors like the Metox and later the Naxos, designed to pick up Allied radar sweeps before the U-boats themselves were seen. A radar meant to detect them could, in turn, reveal the hunter's position. It was a technological duel fought in darkness, measure and countermeasure, noise and silence. By choosing total silence, the captain effectively turned back the clock on warfare. His convoy sailed without the comfort of radar-guided eyes or sonar-guided ears. Instead, they relied on seamanship, the timeless skills of reading the wind, stars, and compass bearings. Engineers in the engine rooms throttled RPMs to a calculated low frequency, minimizing cavitation. Escort ships adjusted their depth charges to safe settings so no accidental explosions would betray the formation. The convoy was a moving paradox, surrounded by some of the most advanced electronics of the war, yet functioning as though it were 1916. It was the deliberate denial of technology, and that restraint became its own kind of mastery. The Admiralty's post-war analyses later confirmed what that captain had intuitively known. U-boats depended as much on Allied emissions as their own instruments. The silence removed data from the equation. The hunters were blind, deaf, and increasingly desperate. In the end, technology had not been abandoned, it had been outsmarted. 4. The leadership angle. War at sea is not only fought with machines, it is carried on by the shoulders of those who make decisions in darkness. The convoy's commander, an experienced escort officer, understood something vital about the psychology of command. He knew that silence breeds fear, not only in his own men, but in the enemy as well. His leadership was marked by calm precision. Survivors later recalled that he rarely raised his voice, never allowed panic to root take. Orders were issued in advance, often written, so that when radio silence began, there would be no uncertainty. Before departure, he briefed his officers in a dimly lit wardroom. Charts spread before them, he outlined every course change, every fallback pattern, every contingency. When the order, "silent running," was given, every man knew exactly what to do, because he had already rehearsed it in his mind. That preparation was the true genius of the operation. In silence, there could be no improvisation. Discipline became destiny. At the same time, the captain knew the risks. If a single U-boat managed to make contact, the entire convoy could be annihilated before reinforcements could arrive. Without radar or sonar, the escorts would have only their lookouts and instincts. Yet he trusted in something deeper than technology: human rhythm. He knew that a well-trained convoy could navigate by timing alone, that his escorts could sense formation gaps by the shape of the sea's surface. In this, his leadership echoed that of other great anti-submarine commanders, men like Johnny Walker, Donald McIntyre, and Frederick "Johnny" Sherbrooke, officers who believed in coordination, discipline, and intuition. But this unnamed captain's contribution was subtler. He transformed silence into unity. His crews obeyed not because of fear, but because they felt the weight of every life behind them, the soldiers, nurses, and civilians who depended on the convoy's survival. And when dawn came, when they realized they had passed through the killing zone untouched, it wasn't relief that filled the ships. It was awe. They had done something no doctrine had ever fully tested. They had beaten the Wolfpacks not by fighting harder, but by refusing to be found. 5. The enemy's angle. For the U-boat crews, silence was both mystery and torment.
Life aboard a Type 7 submarine was a study of sensory deprivation, cramped, foul, perpetually tense. Men lived by the sound of engines and propellers, by the hum of the hydrophone. Every whisper of the sea could mean a convoy, a destroyer, or death approaching fast. When the convoys began to go silent, confusion spread through the Wolfpacks. German operators reported unusual quiet sectors in their nightly transmissions. Some believed the British had changed frequencies. Others blamed atmospheric interference. A few suspected new Allied jamming technology. None imagined that the Allies had simply chosen to say nothing at all. U-boat commanders surfaced into stormy seas, scanning the horizon for silhouettes that never appeared. They launched torpedoes at phantom noises. Some even collided with one another while maneuvering blind. Admiral Dönitz, in his headquarters at Naval, grew frustrated. His carefully coordinated Wolfpacks could not strike what they could not locate. In a war where coordination was everything, silence fractured his strategy. Each submarine became an island, isolated by the very communication discipline that once made them strong. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. German morale suffered, patrols stretched longer, fuel ran low, and the Atlantic began to feel endless again. The sense of dominance the U-boat arm had enjoyed in 1941 to 42 began to erode. A few commanders noted the eerie emptiness in their patrol logs, quote, "No contact, only static." That static, the void between signals, was the sound of defeat. The silent convoy trick was not a single event nor a secret weapon. It was a change of thinking. The moment the hunted learned that sometimes, to survive, one must make the ocean forget they exist. And in the cold spring of 1943, as the balance of the Atlantic War began to turn, that lesson would reach its climax in one unforgettable night.
North Atlantic, March 1943. Coordinates roughly 50 degrees north, 35 west, the center of the Black Pit. For days, the convoy had sailed unseen, engines throttled to a low, deliberate hum. The weather had turned savage, wind howled across the decks, icy spray coated the railings like glass. The ocean was a chaos of heaving black waves, towering higher than the ships themselves. In the storm's fury, the silence seemed almost impossible to maintain, yet it held. The escorts moved like ghosts, invisible even to each other, their formations guided by timing alone. Then came the first sign. At 0200 hours, a lookout aboard a corvette glimpsed a faint orange glow, the exhaust flare of a U-boat surfacing to recharge its batteries. The captain of the corvette raised binoculars, but said nothing. No order shouted, no alarm sounded. He merely adjusted course by a few degrees, a silent maneuver in a silent war. The convoy passed on. The U-boat, unaware, dove again, expecting to reacquire the sound of propellers, but there was nothing to hear. Hours later, at dawn, the same submarine reported back to headquarters. No contact, convoy not located. The Wolfpack, spread across miles of ocean, waited for the telltale radio chatter that always marked a convoy's passing. None came. Deep beneath the waves, frustration grew. In one boat, U-123, a veteran crew strained over their hydrophones. Normally, the sound of a convoy was unmistakable, a deep, rolling bass, like thunder across the water. Tonight, they heard only the moan of the storm. The commander cursed quietly. "They're near, but they're hiding from us." By the afternoon of the second day, more U-boats had converged. Reports to Dönitz grew contradictory. One claimed the convoy was northbound, another swore it was heading south. No one could agree. The Atlantic had swallowed their prey whole. But the silence was not perfect. At 2940 hours, a merchantman, the SS Empire trader, suffered engine trouble and fell behind.
Standard protocol demanded it signal the escorts, but under the new order, no transmission was allowed. The ship limped on, a lone speck adrift in 1,000 miles of darkness. Minutes later, a periscope broke the surface less than a mile away. U-614, prowling alone, spotted the lagging freighter through the storm. A single torpedo was fired. It struck mid-ship. The explosion tore the night apart. The escorts heard it immediately, the one sound they had sworn not to make. For a moment, panic threatened to unravel the plan. The captain aboard the Convoy flagship, a sloop positioned amidships, faced his test. Break silence and they could call in air cover or reinforcements. Maintain it and they might lose more ships. He chose silence. The escorts altered course in absolute secrecy. They tightened formation, drawing the remaining ships closer together. Depth charges remained unfired. Searchlights stayed cold. The crippled Empire traders slipped beneath the waves within minutes. There were no survivors. The U-boat waited, expecting the usual retaliation. None came. The absence of response confused the commander. Normally, after an attack, escorts would swarm the area, pinging with sonar and dropping charges. But the ocean stayed quiet. Convinced the torpedo had been a fluke, he turned to search elsewhere, straight into the path of another storm front that drove him hundreds of miles off course. By dawn, the convoy was gone. For the men still aboard, the explosion had been a jolt of terror, a reminder that silence was no magic shield. Yet the captain's decision held the line. In the following 48 hours, no further ships were lost. The Wolfpacks, deprived of direction and contact, dispersed into the storm. By the time the weather cleared, Allied reconnaissance aircraft from Iceland finally made visual contact. The convoy had passed safely through the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. What had begun as an act of desperation had become a triumph of nerve and discipline. And though one ship had perished, 10,000 lives had crossed the Atlantic unscathed, carried not by guns or speed, but by the deliberate absence of both. The silence had held. But its full meaning and its validation would only be realized in what came next, when the Admiralty, poring over reports and decrypted German messages, discovered just how completely the U-boats had been blinded.
When the convoy finally reached the relative safety of Allied air cover, its decks were lined with men who hadn't slept in days. Faces gray from exhaustion, uniforms stiff with salt. They had survived what was statistically the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth, and done it without firing a shot. The captain filed his report with the Admiralty in terse, factual language. He made no claim to brilliance. He simply noted that radio silence had been maintained throughout operation and that enemy contact was minimal or absent. It was a dry document, and yet between its lines, it carried the weight of a revolution. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers working on intercepted German traffic began to piece together the other half of the story. In a series of messages from U-boat command, the same frustration appeared again and again. Convoy contact lost, sound traces uncertain, believed weather or atmospheric interference, unable to regain bearings. Dönitz himself, ever methodical, annotated one report in the margin with a simple question: are the British using deception noise? But there was no deception noise. There was nothing, and that was the genius of it. Across the Atlantic, Allied analysts compared radar plots, decrypted transmissions, and survivor accounts from other convoys. They realized that the Silent Convoy had moved directly through a Wolfpacks patrol line and had not been attacked. The U-boats had been there, ready and waiting, but they had never known what passed beneath their periscopes. This was not coincidence. It was proof. The Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division drafted a memorandum in April 1943 noting that under conditions of heavy U-boat concentration, absolute communication silence and mechanical discipline may confer significant survival advantage. The phrase Silent Convoy entered official vocabulary that same month. For decades after, the precise details of that crossing would remain classified. But within naval circles, word spread quickly. Senior officers studied it, debated it, and replicated it. Others dismissed it as luck. "You can't win a war by saying nothing," one old admiral muttered. Yet the data was undeniable. U-boat radio traffic during the week of that convoy showed a complete breakdown of coordinated attack. The Wolfpacks had effectively hunted themselves into confusion, reporting phantom convoys and colliding signals. What the Germans thought was Allied jamming was in truth the echo of their own uncertainty. The convoy's captain received no medal for his decision. There was no fanfare, no press release. His name never appeared in wartime newsreels, but his idea quietly altered the rhythm of the Atlantic War. Over the following months, several other escort commanders began to apply variations of the same method. Controlled silence in areas of high U-boat density, short-range lamps instead of radio, and mechanical synchronization of convoys plotted down to the minute. It was an invisible shift, but its effects rippled outward. By May 1943, what the Germans later called Der Monat der Wende, the month of the turning point, the U-boat fleet was collapsing. Convoys, now heavily escorted and disciplined in silence, began to cross unscathed. Allied aircraft extended their patrols deeper into the mid-Atlantic, closing the once fatal air gap. Losses that had averaged 12 ships a week fell sharply. For the first time, it was the hunters, not the hunted, who feared the dark. In Dönitz's own war diary from May 24, 1943, he wrote with rare resignation, "The enemy's defenses have reached such a level that the effectiveness of our boats is no longer assured." Behind that sentence was a quiet truth. The Germans had been fighting an enemy that had learned to vanish. To the men who had survived that silent crossing, the victory felt subdued. They buried their dead, refueled, and prepared for the next run. The Atlantic never offered peace, only brief pauses between storms. But in the officers' wardroom, among mugs of black tea and stacks of navigation charts, the convoy commander shared a single reflection with his first officer. He said that perhaps the greatest advantage they had wasn't silence itself, but discipline, the collective restraint of thousands of men choosing not to break it. No radar, no weapon, no code machine could replicate that. And in the months that followed, as the Allies pressed the advantage and the U-boats dwindled to ruin, the ocean slowly began to change character. Whereas once the night had been full of flares and torpedo trails, now there was only calm. Convoys moved more freely. Escort captains grew confident. The silent convoy trick, as it came to be known in quiet circles, was not a trick at all. It was a lesson written in endurance and human precision. A fleet had survived not by overpowering the sea, but by harmonizing with it. And when that last ship of that convoy steamed into Halifax harbor, its hull scarred but intact, the men who stood on deck looked out at the misty coastline and understood something their enemies had not, that sometimes silence isn't the absence of command, it's command perfected. The tide of the Atlantic War had turned, but victory always leaves a reckoning in the cost, the consequence, and the memory of those who never returned.
In the weeks following the Silent Convoy's safe arrival, the Admiralty began a quiet investigation. Naval historians would later describe it as one of the most understated but significant tactical reviews of the entire war. There were no medals, No broadcasts from London, no speeches of triumph, only a series of memos marked restricted, circulating through the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. They analyzed the convoy's passage, the absence of enemy contact, and the curious failure of the U-boat Wolfpacks that had been waiting squarely along its route. The findings were sobering and extraordinary. Enemy radio intercepts confirmed that at least 6 German submarines had been operating within striking range of the convoy, yet not one had managed a sustained attack. Only a single torpedo had hit, the one that sank SS Empire Trader. All others had fired blind, or not at all. In the final Admiralty summary, a single phrase stood out. Evidence suggests convoy success due to minimal radiated energy signature. In other words, silence. That one word became the foundation for a new set of operational doctrines. Within months, the Admiralty began issuing specific instructions for silent running convoy conditions under threat of interception. Radar sweeps were to be used sparingly, sonar pings only on confirmed targets, and radio transmissions limited to prearranged codes flashed by lamp or flag. It was not an order born from superstition or luck, but from statistical reality. Convoys that practiced silence were reporting fewer encounters, fewer losses, and fewer sightings by enemy aircraft. What the Germans had called weather interference was in fact the sound of their advantage dissolving. By summer 1943, U-boat losses had skyrocketed. 41 submarines were destroyed in May alone, the highest single-month total of the war. The hunter-killer groups, led by a man like Captain Johnny Walker, began taking the offensive, sweeping U-boat routes with relentless precision. But underpinning those successes was a subtle shift, a psychological edge that silence had introduced. For years, the U-boats had dictated the rhythm of battle. They struck first, vanished, and waited for panic to ripple through the convoys. But now, the silence unnerved them. Submarine captains began to doubt their instruments, misread sonar echoes, and waste torpedoes on phantom targets. And while Walker's aggressive tactics won headlines, it was the silent convoys that preserved the lifeline, the vast, uncelebrated movement of food, oil, and soldiers that sustained the war effort. Each successful crossing meant fuel for Allied bombers, supplies for armies in North Africa and Italy, and food for millions of civilians in Britain. By one estimate, that single convoy, the one that had vanished into the storm and re-emerged intact, delivered enough material to feed and equip 200,000 men for a week of combat. The 10,000 lives it saved rippled outward, shaping battles that would unfold months later on distant shores. In June 1943, Admiral Sir Max Horton wrote privately to a senior colleague, "It is becoming increasingly clear that the less we speak, the more we live. Silence in these waters has become the most articulate weapon we possess." That line, though never published, captured the essence of what had happened in the Atlantic that spring. The convoys had always been about endurance, but endurance had evolved. It had learned to be invisible. Yet beyond the statistics and memoranda, the true aftermath was human. In Liverpool, Halifax, and Greenock, sailors stumbled ashore, pale, exhausted, and grateful. They had survived the black pit. They had lived through nights when every wave could have been death. And as they readied for another crossing, they carried with them a new kind of superstition, not about luck or saints or the sea, but about silence itself. They had learned to trust the stillness.
By the end of 1943, the impact of that single silent crossing had spread far beyond one convoy's survival. It had quietly reshaped Allied naval doctrine, influencing everything from training manuals to the mindset of commanders across the Atlantic. The Admiralty formalized the lessons under the title Emission Control Protocols, EMCON, a term that would live long after the war. The principle was simple but profound. A fleet that cannot be heard cannot be hunted. Convoy commanders were now instructed to consider silence as an offensive weapon, not merely a defensive measure. Radio operators were drilled to treat every transmission as if it were a flare fired into the night. Engineers refined machinery to reduce mechanical noise. Even gunners were trained to coordinate by stopwatch and prearranged signal instead of verbal commands. What began as a desperate act had become a philosophy: precision through restraint. For the Germans, the consequences were devastating. By late 1943, U-boat losses reached unsustainable levels. Allied technology continued to advance: new escort carriers, longer-range Liberator bombers, better radar. But the foundation of that success lay in something intangible. The Silent Convoys had broken the psychological supremacy of the Wolfpacks. The ocean, once the domain of German hunters, was now turning against them. Post-German accounts would later confirm what the Allies had suspected. Many U-boat captains described the sudden disappearance of targets during the spring of 1943 as the time the sea went empty. Others believed the British had invented some kind of underwater masking field. None could comprehend that it was simply discipline, human will erasing its own signature. The shift was more than tactical. It marked a turning point in how modern warfare understood information, the presence or absence of it, as a battlefield. Every ping, every pulse, every transmission was a footprint, and by choosing not to leave one, the Allies had found a new form of control. This thinking would outlast the war. During the Cold War decades that followed, navies around the world built entire strategies around the same principle: stealth through silence. Nuclear submarines prowled beneath oceans following EMCON protocols almost identical to those born from that 1943 convoy. Modern stealth aircraft, digital encryption, radar absorption, all trace their philosophical lineage to that same wartime revelation: that the absence of signal can be as powerful as signal. But in 1943, those theories were still personal. They belonged to the men who lived them. Among them, the convoy's captain faded back into duty. His name appeared only briefly in reports, buried among hundreds of other operations. Yet those who served under him remembered his calm, the way he had stood on the bridge during that silent crossing, one hand on the compass, listening to the ocean as though it were speaking directly to him. Years later, one of his crewmen, a young signalman at the time, wrote in his memoir, "He taught us that the sea has ears, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is to keep his mouth shut." That sentence, quiet, unassuming, could have served as the epitaph for the entire Battle of the Atlantic. By 1943, the U-boats were in retreat. The convoys sailed with increasing confidence, and Allied supply lines surged with life. The great gamble of silence had become standard practice, not out of superstition, but out of proof. And so the Atlantic, which had once echoed with the sound of exploding ships and dying engines, began to change tone. The deep roars of war gave way to something else: the low, steady hum of victory. What began as a single captain's intuition had become an empire of understanding. Carried on every wave and every whisper across the sea, the guns would fall silent soon enough, but the silence that saved those 10,000 men would echo long after the war's end, not as an absence, but as a legacy. History often remembers the loudest victories: the thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the cheers that follow the fall of an enemy. But the Atlantic tells a different story. It remembers the quiet ones: the convoys that slipped through fog and storm without trace, the men who held their breath as depth charges fell, the captains who fought not with gunfire, but with discipline, patience, and silence. In the great machinery of war, silence is rarely celebrated. It feels passive, unheroic. Yet in 1943, it became the sharpest weapon the Allies possessed, invisible, precise, absolute. That single act, one captain's decision to mute his fleet, represented something far greater than a tactical choice. It was a turning point in the philosophy of modern warfare. The understanding that restraint can be strength, that invisibility can be power. The 10,000 men who survived that crossing did not think of themselves as heroes. They were sailors and soldiers, tired and hungry, steering their way through the endless dark. But together, they had proven that control is not always about domination. Sometimes it is about listening, waiting, and refusing to be seen. Their silence was not fear. It was mastery. Decades later, when radar became stealth and sonar gave way to digital camouflage, the echoes of that convoy could still be heard. Every submarine that glides beneath the ocean in silence, every stealth aircraft that evades detection, every encryption protocol that hides a signal, all are descendants of that same quiet night in the Atlantic. The war for control of the seas was not won by the loudest engines or the biggest guns. It was won, in part, by men who understood that the ocean itself listens, and that to survive it, one must learn to disappear within its voice. So when we speak of heroes, we might also remember those who chose not to speak at all, those who kept the radios dark, the pings silent, and the ships steady through the storm. Because sometimes the greatest victory in war is not the sound of triumph, but the sound of nothing at all.